Good morning. Let's do this. I don't have, I am afraid, much in the way of new gear to show you. Thankfully, I've been able to back off purchases just for a little bit here. I have one or two pieces that are still coming in that I'm waiting for. I showed you the new headset for the gravel bike. And I'm really excited to get that installed, but I can't, there's no point in installing it until I get the new front brake hanger that's on its way. That should be here, I think, today, at which point I can knock the old headset out and take a swing at pressing a new one in. And that will be really good because that bike is just desperately in need of that. And then probably inevitably a bit more TLC. I think the rear wheel needs a touch of truing. Anyway, so not a whole lot of new gear. I'll give you a peek at like a serious piece of new gear that's always off still, but still on the horizon. And it looks like this. What? Oh, yeah, that's a modern mountain bike. Well, we say modern-ish. It's still steel. It's still hardtail. But, it'll have like modern-ish sized wheels, 27.5 plus. And it will certainly have modern geometry and reach and proportions and all of that. And that will be really good. I'm looking forward to that. But it occurred to me, I did a video a bit ago about, all right, so I had a story a couple weeks ago about an experience I had with a bike in the early 2000s that sort of like reshaped, or certainly at the very least redirected my focus on some kinds of bikes, and how that was really, really, really important. In that particular case, it was Gary Fisher Excalibur, which was my first experience with longer travel suspension, and I'm putting that in giant air quotes because at the time that was 100 millimeters of travel on the front end, and I know that seems laughable these days, but this is at a time period where most of the serious mountain bikes had maybe 63 millimeters of travel, 80 on the outside. So 100 really did feel substantially longer. It also had hydraulic disc brakes, and it also had meaningful tires and a riser bar on it. And at the time, it was a Gary Fisher, and they were doing their Genesis geometry. And if you don't know anything about that, basically, their chainstays were about a half-inch shorter than most other people's, certainly production bikes. And then their top tubes, they would lengthen them by a half-inch, and they would shorten the stem by a half-inch to compensate in an overall reach. And now it's easy to look back and be like, oh, that was a tiny little baby step. But at the time, it was a polarizing thing for people. Some people were really into it. Some people were not really into it. But in this particular case, that bike made a sort of a shattering difference on how I perceived mountain bikes and what they were, what they should be, and what they could be. But I want to take you back earlier today to an earlier experience I had. That really, it's interesting looking back now to sort of connect these dots, to sort of figure out how I ended up where I am in my taste and my proclivities on mountain bikes. But anyway, so this is one. I don't know the exact year. I know that it was in the late 90s. I know it was either 95 or 96, right? And I had some friends who were involved in the grassroots racing program at Independent Fabrication, who at the time had just started up and were out of Somerville, Massachusetts. Now, if you don't know, IndyFab, which is still around, you can still go buy a bike from them. They're based out in New Hampshire now, but at the time they were the remnants. They were Fat City Cycles. Had shut down and, well, moved on, I suppose. And Merlin was in the midst of doing similar stuff. And some people from, mostly from Fat City, had gotten together and had started Independent Fabrications as a sort of the next generation of bike company beyond Fat City, right? Fat City being famous for the Yo Eddie. Well, other things too, but the Yo Eddie. Anyway, so IndieFab starts up. They're in Somerville, and I had some friends at the time that were doing grassroots racing stuff with them. So they were both riding fairly early independent fabrication mountain bike frames, which are called a deluxe, and they were the business at the time. And there were a couple things that IndieFab was doing that was making them sort of special, right, in that era. One is that they were doing Reynolds 853, which was pretty much brand new at the time on mountain bikes, which was kind of hot business in those days. They were doing extraordinary paint. They had their own paint booth, and they were just doing, like at the time, what felt like sort of lunacy. It was all wet paint. There was no powder coat, and there was decaling and overspraying and fades and just really, really complicated stuff coming out of there. And that was rad. And they were the spiritual successor to Fat City and the Yo. And that was, I think in a lot of ways, you could make a solid argument that the Yo Eddie was a serious East Coast single track bike at a time where there wasn't a lot of that. So anyway, IndieFab had all this momentum, and I knew these guys. So one day they told me that they wanted to take me down to Independent Fabrication in Somerville and show me around, and that that I should totally ride one of the bikes. Okay, well, I'm not going to say no to that. So I go down there and like we hang out for a little bit and see some stuff, and I get taken up, as I recall, to a loft that had a bunch of show bikes in it that had been built for showing at various things. And we pulled out, it was like a 19-inch, back when we measured bikes by inches, it was like a 19-inch deluxe frame. And there were a couple of things about it that were important for me, right? I mean, besides the fact that they were letting some high school kid borrow a couple $1,000s worth of bike from them to go ride in the woods. So first things first, it was not my first steel mountain bike, because you have to understand, at the time, most mountain bikes were made of steel, or, you know, maybe aluminum, but it wasn't uncommon, right? So I had a steel bike. So it was steel, but it was really good steel. That was first bit. Second bit, this particular bike had like kind of all the fixings on it. As I recall, it had a Marzocchi fork. And this, again, late 90s, back when Marzocchi was good. There was a spell there where they weren't. But this is back when they were really good. This was a coil sprung fork. I want to say it was like a 4-inch travel, but it might have been 3. I think it was like an 80 mil fork. But it was a bomber, one flavor or another. And the bike had, I think, like 8-speed XT on it or whatever. And, you know, rim brakes, because that's the era that we were in. But it had, and a flat bar, right, and like a long stem. It's if you looked at this now, it looked like a very retro mountain bike. But like, there were two details here that are sort of burned into my mind. And one is that it had this bomber fork on the front. And the second is that the tires they had spec'd were Tioga factory DH, and I think they were like 2.3-inch tires, which at the time was like, holy crap wide. I mean, everybody was running like 195s or 2.0s or 2.1s maybe. And so a 2.3 just felt enormous. And if you've never seen a Tioga factory DH tire, they look like a moto tire. They're a round profile, big pyramidal studs sticking up all over them. They were the first tire I remember riding that you could really lean into and roost off-road. And so between this super high quality bike that had this amazing like purpley and blue flame paint job on it, but between this really, really, really good steel bike and like a fairly serious working shock fork, right? I mean, we're talking at an era where like the RockShox had like, I think maybe the Judy out, certainly Indies were out. Like there were a lot of elastometer sprung forks that were still on the market. There was a lot of sort of like air stuff that was on the market that wasn't very good because it had just huge amounts of stiction at the seals. And along comes this Marzocchi with an open oil bath and coil springs, and it's just plush and responsive. A complete and absolute revelation for me of what a shock fork could be and should be and what it allowed. And those tires too. The tires were just like, it was interesting because there's always this impetus for lightweight stuff. A lot of road racers get into this, and people that are used to counting grams, and I want to pretend that I never counted grams, but I was always aware, and so you're always looking for like the 1.9 tires that had like the really thin casings on them with light tubes, and to try to reduce your wheel weight and all the rest. And here come these DH tires with a fat casing and fat tread and like chunky studs on them, and what do you know? The difference is palatable. Like tires go from being like 45 psi rock hard skittery things to like 30 or 35 psi capable cornering, braking, traction generating devices. And I'd never felt something like that on that bike. It felt like a whole different thing. Needless to say, when I bought my next mountain bike, I didn't buy that bike because I can't afford that. I couldn't afford that kind of thing. Or I wasn't willing to anyway, I suppose. I bought a bike that had a RockShox SID on the front that was aluminum, but it was like a proper modern mountain bike in the very late 90s, in 99. And then immediately, God, what a weird time to have fallen into all this like hard. The North Shore influence starts up. So that bike, which was sold as a flat handlebarred, like cross-country racing bike, ended up with a riser bar and bash guard and all manner of other things. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, it was this interesting, that Independent Fabrication and then that Gary Fisher, for two totally different reasons and in totally different ways, really opened my eyes. Since I've always thought of mountain bikes a little bit along the analogy of hamburgers, right? Like you can get a plain hamburger, right? And then you can put stuff on it. And when you put stuff on it, you're adding calories and you're adding fat and stuff, which may or may not be desirable. It's certainly going to sit heavier in your stomach. And I think there's this balance, right, where like an anemic hamburger isn't particularly tasty. It might not, right? Like it doesn't have necessarily all of the flavor, and it doesn't have all the roundness, and it doesn't have what you want. On the other hand, if you go too far down that road, the other direction, you end up with like those stupid hamburgers with like the skewer sticking through the top of them because they're so tall they're just going to fall over from all the disparate garbage that someone has jammed into the things. And I think for me here, I've always been willing to tolerate a little extra on mountain bikes, right? Like, yeah, I'll take the bacon on that burger, right? The bacon in this case being an analogy for like heavy, wide tires. I'll take that because the trade-off in traction is so good, and I'm not racing these things, so I've never been overly concerned about speed. But traction allows you to get away with stuff that you can't any other way. So, like I've always been willing to take some of those hits, right? The heavier tires, yeah, okay, that can work for me. Like the wide handlebars back before that was super popular for the extra leverage, and whatever it was, longer suspension and all the rest. Anyway, it's sort of interesting to think that this new bike that I'm getting is going to be in some ways a spiritual successor to each of those interactions I've had with bikes along the way. And that have sort of shaped my worldview about the trails I like to ride and how I like to ride them and what I want the bike to do while I'm doing it and all of the rest. And I fully realized that my view of those things is at odds with much of the rest of the cycling world. Ergo, me not riding full suspension carbon fiber like apparently everybody else. But that's okay. I've always been reasonably comfortable with being my own thing on a bike. So anyway, yeah, it's interesting. I went looking for pictures of that IndyFab show bike, and from that era, it's not like everybody had cell phones and cameras. Like pictures are not easy to come by, and I couldn't find a picture of it. I'll keep looking. Maybe I'll find one of these days. But yeah, just a really interesting and formative experience for me on a bike. But I wanted to share just so as we creep closer to my new bike. Maybe you guys can understand, or better understand, I guess, why I make the choices that I make about bikes and about geometries and about parts and all the rest. So, anyway, thanks for listening to me blather, I suppose. And Thanks for joining me in the studio, and maybe I'll have some trinket to show you next time when it shows up. Certainly, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, to have that gravel bike back up together. And one of these days, we're going to have to do a bike check, because there's 2 bikes down here that you haven't seen yet for the most part. So, yeah. Thanks.